18.5 millimeters across. That is the clean, cold diameter of a 12-gauge throat. Not rumor, not bravado, not a barrack's tale. Just a round fact measured by a steel caliper that clicks softly in a quiet archive. A pattern board sheet, browned by damp storage, preserves rings of white chalk and tight constellations of dark holes. 9 clustered stars inside a circle drawn at 30 paces. A pencil note smudged by a thumbprint smelling faintly of paste reads 00 at Jungle Range. The board came from a field test on a small Pacific island, its edges eaten by mildew, yet the geometry remains, arguing with a legend that refuses to die, that shotguns are for birds, not battle. The card says otherwise, calmly. Geometry does not flinch. In its pocked surface, a myth meets a yardstick in the lamplight. Subscribe for more bedtime history. Under a tarp stretched taut with fraying rope, a lantern burned low and amber, making a pool of gentle light on a damp wooden crate and the sleeved barrel it held. A Japanese corporal, his hands smelling of camphor and oiled cloth, crouched in the hush before dawn and listened to the wet, linty whisper of palm fronds moving in sea wind. He knew the grain of his rifle stock by feel, the ridge in the wood that always caught at the pad of his thumb. A mosquito's thin song hovered near his ear, then drifted away. From beyond the grove came a thump like a footfall, and then a soft, mechanical sigh. The short, slick draw of metal on metal that did not belong to their own weapons. He laid his canteen down in the sand so it would not clatter, breath shallow, stomach tight. The sound slid through darkness again, less a threat than a riddle, close and not close, like a hinge that wanted answering. In the dark, unfamiliar noise carries a different weight than daylight names. On a table stained with bluing salts, an American armorer set a pattern board at the jungle's edge and chalked concentric rings, his fingers powdery and his lips tasting of rain. He marked 20 paces, 30, then 40, feeling mud cling to his boots with every step as birds stitched small calls through mist. The shotguns. Receiver was warm from a test run. The pump slid like silk pulled through a ring. He thumbed in brass-cased shells because paper swelled under this heat, and he knew better than to trust paper in an air that perfumed its own weight with salt. The first shot cracked with a short bark, louder under the canopy, then echoed in the hollows of banyan roots. He saw the paper jump and the chalk dust leap in a halo. He counted the holes, wrote down the numbers, a small ritual in pencil that dried under his breath. In that era, they measured not just what a weapon did, but also where it reached confidence and where it simply ended. Military myths often move faster than supply chains. Still, they leave residue that archivists learn to read by feel. Decades after a German protest in 1918, the word unsporting drifted across mess tables in distant garrisons like a curl of pipe smoke that clung to wool, and men repeated it because it tasted authoritative. Yet the United States never conceded that close-range buckshot violated any law of war, instead logging pattern density and pellet retention at practical distances. The contrast looked almost like 2 rooms lit by different bulbs, one saturated with inherited etiquette, the other flooded by measurements pinned to boards with thumbtacks. An island wind carries both tones at once, the dry scrape of old phrases and the crisp tap of a caliper against a barrel ring. The jungle, damp and green, cares little about either. It listens and it holds. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. In the hush of a perimeter line, an American sentry leaned against a sandbag that pressed gritty patterns into his sleeve as rain began to drum softly on canvas. He cradled a pump action close, its heat shield ribbed under his palm like the back of an eel, and he could feel the magazine's weight as an assurance, not an invitation. Across jungle shadow, distant frogs pulsed a chorus, and he thought about the last practice pattern at 25 paces, how the 9 dark marks stitched the board tighter than his expectations, yet he knew that beyond 40 the pellet strayed. The truth of the tool lay neither in myth nor scorn, but in a shaped circle of reach, a near field where its command was absolute. He ran a dry rag through the ejection port, smelling old oil, hearing cotton rasp over steel that had been hot in sun and cold at night. Somewhere a twig snapped, or maybe that was only memory rehearsing its lines. On some nights certainty arrives with a quiet click, on others it arrives with silence. Across the grove, old forms of courage met new geometries that did not care about ceremony. For generations, Japanese infantry drilled with long barrels and bayonet practice that turned wood and steel into extensions of the chest, breath, and command, as cicadas shrieked from pines in an unbroken electric curtain. The thrust and turn had a rhythm the hand could learn in the dark. An enemy at spear's length was a puzzle already solved by muscle. Yet the jungle narrowed that distance under dripping vines, as if the air itself rethreaded expectation. A compact pump with a bayonet lug and a metal shroud changed the conversation of the first 10 meters, proving that space can be redrawn by patterns invisible until they arrive. Ocean damp layered every surface with a thin taste of salt, and cords of rope went from stiff to pliant to stiff again through the day. The gulf between rifle reach and pellet reach became the shape of a surprise that lodged not in the body but in the plan. Rumors of bird guns turned into lists of requisitions and, just as quickly, into lists of restrictions that lived in files smelling faintly of paste, suggesting that the shotgun lived a double life as both favorite and stepchild. The quartermaster counted crates that sweated green lacquer where brass met foam, and he logged who drew buckshot and who returned empty cardboard sleeves gone soft at the corners. In that age, paper shells swelled so stubbornly that some men nicknamed them sponges. Brass shells were a relief you could feel through the thumb. The paper peeled, the brass cleaned easily with a wipe that left a thin sheen like a meadow after rain. In the same logbook, a line cautioned that trench guns were to be conserved for patrol leads, guards, and units who crossed thresholds first. Supply is a quiet form of doctrine, and doctrine often flows through the fingers of the person who stamps forms under a swaying bulb that smells of dust and heat. Within the black mouth of a limestone cave, a marine engineer crouched, breath fogging his face lightly, and touched the rock that sweated a cold film of mineral water. Even his canteen tasted slightly of stone. He had learned to tap the pump's action gently to avoid the broadcast clack that echoed like castanets in Cavanair. Inside, sound grew teeth. He knew the drill that traveled from platoon to platoon like a recipe. Light a short fuse, toss a small charge to stir the dust and the will, then step to the edge and wait for grit to rain down like ash. When he finally stepped in, the muzzle led his vision like a lantern beam, its ribbed heat shield warm against his fingers. In that inner dark, the geometry of a pattern was not abstraction, but a broom that worked within arm's length of an idea. Dust perfumed the throat, and the heart counted in beats, not numbers, not because of fear, but because of practice. Reports after actions read like ledger books decorated by weather ink that ran at one edge, a smudge where a wet hand steadied a page, a leaf bug trapped flat between two sheets. Effective penetration in heavy brush at near range, one careful hand inscribed neatly, still willing to measure in words what a board once showed with holes. The next line conceded, ineffective beyond medium distance. You could hear the humility of that sentence in the way the nib lifted slightly between beyond and medium. In that era, a tool was not magic or mistake. It was a choice made plain by its limits and its triumphs in equal measure. Rain made the margins buckle and smell like tea left overnight. Dust settled in swirls. Here and there, a small note described the way night attacks ended faster when a pellet cloud met them at the wire, as if the clock had been tilted toward morning by the shortest swing of a hand. On an island's quiet perimeter, far from any parade ground, the night held its breath between palm trunks cut to stakes and wires that glinted faintly in starlight. The ocean rolled a low, patient rumor of itself. An intruder steps where sand cools quickest under shadow, and then the world lurches as a short roar folds voice into wind, then into insects, and the light behind the guard tent jumps along canvas ribs. Shock, in that moment, is not just surprise at pain, it is the way plans thrown like ropes suddenly go slack. Pellets do not announce themselves with elegant trajectories. They arrive as a shrug of small impacts that change nothing and everything at once. The guard's eyes water, not from sorrow but from powder that perfumed the air with peppered heat. The strange thing about near range is how it turns time thick, like syrup poured slowly and caught mid-fall. Did the old manuals ever prepare anyone for how short a meter feels when sound blooms? Boxes with green stencils traveled by landing craft and by hand, and then some sat untouched under tarps through entire seasons as other priorities pressed in. That is one way suppression works, not as diktat but as delay. A note pinned neatly to a crate's edge said, "Reserved for shore patrol and special tasks," revealing that sometimes the most dangerous positions are the ones that feel like errands. Men argued over which mission counted as special, and tools slept in shade until someone with authority drew in pencil and called it doctrine. A lieutenant who loved numbers drew circles on a board every free afternoon. The sergeant who managed schedules saw that and smiled, then penciled him onto a beach patrol that did not get cancelled by rain. The smell of wet rope mingled with machine oil, and the day's list of tasks softened along the edges where sweat touched it. Allocation can be as decisive as any volley. Night breathes, palms sway, the low sea presses and recedes. Years later, divers moving through flat green water in a lagoon found a crate fused by corrosion to coral, its nails flaked to lace, its lid half gone. They traced letters in crust with gloved thumbs until a faint 12GA rose like a watermark under sunlight diffracted by waves. Inside, brass shells lay like biscuits turned verdigris, yet their geometry persisted, a kind of calendar kept by metal. Fish nosed the edges, the diver's bubbles drummed against hull ribs in a quick rhythm that felt like rain falling upward. One shell, wiped on a thigh, revealed W0 stampery shallow but legible, and the diver grinned into his mouthpiece, taste of rubber and salt thick in his cheeks. Above the surface, the world smelled of old boat paint, gasoline and sun-warmed water that carried a faint sweetness like wet coconut. Rediscovery often arrives not with fanfare but with a small private nod at something that simply refused to vanish. In a dry attic, a civilian years after the storm of empires slid a dust-caked canvas bag from behind a cedar wardrobe and found oiled steel hidden by the soft scent of wood shavings. He unbuckled leather that had gone stiff and felt it flex back slowly under his palm. A short barrel with a strip of perforated metal lay asleep like a sleeping animal with ribs that breathed only when light touched them. He did not fire it. Instead, he swabbed it gently with a clean cloth as his radio murmured weather, and the evening wind nudged a curtain so that dust danced like pollen. He found a folded letter under the sling, words stained with palm oil so faint that his fingers perfumed themselves as he handled it. The letter mentioned a night patrol without saying what happened, as if writing could respect silence as much as it records fact. Objects sometimes preserve what words decline to tell. A roll of microfilm clicked through a reader under the watch of a librarian whose sweater held the faint smell of wool and old paper, revealing block letters and charts that looked almost like astronomy. Pellet counts plotted at distances that fit only a certain kind of terrain. The notes had a sparse music, pattern held at 30, dispersion acceptable, avoid over-range engagements. The driest lines sometimes carry the warmest implications for those who had to walk them. Here were tables that had been marked confidential long enough for secrecy to lose flavor and leave only the salt of detail. The reader's lamp traced a faint buzzing circle on the desk as frames snapped past. Declassification changes a sound more than a meaning. The squeak of a knob loosening, the whisper of plastic sliding, the heat from the bulb blooming on the back of a wrist. Archaeology is not always a shovel, sometimes it is a lens. Local islanders, for whom the war lived first as thunder and then as rust, tell of palm fronds punctured in clusters, suggesting a visitor that travelled not as a single messenger, but as a small chorus. After storms, children found brass pockets that perfumed their hands with metal and soil. They used them to keep flowers from wilting too fast. Stories that tasted of grandparents' kitchens spoke of a strange American gun that made many little dents at once on water barrels. No one argued over the model because the barrels testified with their own stippled skin. The smell of pandanus mats and sea breezes seeps into narratives, giving them weight as real as any ledger. For generations, memory has a way of counting without numbers, holding both fear and curiosity like shells in one hand. These are not technical treatises, yet they outline, in texture and timber, the same geometry the pattern boards did in chalk. Heat shields riddled with long vents told their own aesthetic story under harsh sun, lines of shadow along metal that seemed to breathe as the weapon cooled. The bayonet lug, heavy and square, gave the front a chin. It felt deliberate, a promise that the tool could still speak the older language of steel meeting steel if demanded. Stalks of dark walnut sat slick with sweat, then dried to a soft satin under a rag that smelled of linseed. Cylinders bored for widespread contrasted with tighter chokes on sporting barrels. One was a line drawn as a quick brush, the other a pen. The pump stroke had its own grammar. You learned to keep it continuous, as a baker learns to knead without thinking. Under lantern light, geometry married ritual. One must be calm to practice both well. In that marriage, the myth of only for birds melted like daytime mist. In some units, shame did the work of censorship, not because the tool was unlawful, but because some men had drunk older ideas of proper war until they left a lingering aftertaste like stale coffee in an enamel mug. A few reports, wearily careful, phrased things in ways that made small miracles sound like mere errands. Silence held the tone that pride sometimes takes when it fears ridicule. Yet in the same stacks, other voices praised the short, violent mercy of a near-range defense that ended assaults in seconds, sparing men on both sides longer attrition. The contradiction sat like two tones on the same wind, resonating until the ear learned to separate them. Sometimes a myth survives not because it is loved, but because it is polite enough to nod its way around a table and refill cups. Finding the balance meant owning both the shock and the stillness that followed, without theatrics. Long after the battlefields cooled, range officers on coastal bases discovered that humidity could make cardboard shells swell like bread dough left too long under a damp cloth, and malfunctions taught hard lessons more efficiently than memos. Brass-cased ammunition, though heavier and more expensive, sang through feeding cycles with the smooth rhythm of an oiled pulley. Men learned to store shells in boxes lined with waxed paper. They learned to sun-dry cartons that had absorbed night's dew, crinkling them until they felt like fall leaves. The percussion of rain on tin roofs set the tempo for workshop conversations about oxidation, lube viscosity, and the honest limits of hardware in warm, wet air. In that setting, the shotgun's efficacy was not a brag but a budget line, its weakness not a scandal but a chore. Knowledge smelled of gun oil, tasted of salt on dry lips, and rendered opinion softer without erasing it. Certain patrols that hugged mangrove margins treated the shotgun as the first and last word that needed saying in spaces cluttered by roots, vines, and the drifting clothesline of bug-swarming air. The ritual was practical. Point man carried the pump, second carried a carbine, third carried a radio that hummed like a sleep machine when static rolled in. They stepped with the care of people moving through a museum of glass, guiding each other's shoulders, saying little because sound stuck to everything. At 10 meters, pellets wrote a paragraph that no one misread. At 50, they wrote a rumor and were dismissed. Everyone understood. The palm leaves brushed their sleeves like cats. A crab's click-clack sounded like castanets. The weapon mattered because it made a narrow tunnel of certainty around the living, a short hallway where plans that hung by threads could be kept from tearing. The reach of patterning became a domestic art for some ordnance men, almost like bread baking or tuning a guitar. They argued, never loudly, about pellet sizes and whether a particular lot printed tighter or looser, all under a sky that darkened early with tropical clouds. Some swore that blocked barrels dispersed differently if cooled in shade. Others trusted only what chalk rings told them. The board, spattered with old holes and flecked with mildew, leaned like a painting that needed restoration. The pencil rattled in a mug when set down quickly, sounding like bones clacking gently together. Numbers written with wet hands curved gently toward the leaf edges where the paper had puckered. In that era, patience was as important as pride, because a pattern chart without notes about weather and method felt like a story missing its verbs. The quiet art made the loud moments disciplined, and discipline in turn softened fear. The tide slows, even zinc buckles glow. Quiet arranges itself in layers. Some loads found favor not for their raw force, but for how they read the jungle script. Number 4 butt tossing more voices into the near air. 0 swinging heavier syllables. Conversations held by ammo crates settled into a consensus that did not travel well on paper. Still it stood firm at the edge of brush. Race the load against distance and weather, and it tells you which audience it can command. Those conversations tasted of tobacco that had gone sweet with damp, of canned fruit on a tongue that missed fresh things, and of coffee that steadied hands more than minds. One man polished brass until it reflected green leaves in tiny, distorted circles. Another tucked shells into woven bandoliers that squeaked faintly when dry. Personal preferences layered themselves atop doctrine like spices dusted over a stew, not changing the base but lending their own sense to the air. Handlers who worked with dogs often cradled short-barrel pumps for perimeter whispers, trusting the weapon's cone more than a rifle's line to shape the space between teeth and a shadow. The animal's breath puffed in soft white plumes on cool nights. Their pads ticked lightly on wooden walkways. Leather leashes smelled of salt and soap, and the handlers' voices lived in the low register where reassurance grows. When a rustle became a silhouette, the dogs bristled and then quieted, trained to let geometry do the next talking. On many nights, nothing happened. Those were the nights the shotgun mattered too, as a ward more than a wand. Tools become talismans when they anchor routines under miserable conditions. Talismans become tools again when an instant snaps taut and demands a practiced response. The hinge between those roles is almost silent, like a lid settling on a pot. On landing craft nosing through surf, men stowed riot-length guns under bench seats, the wood damp and splintery under wet trousers, trusting them to answer any question that boarded uninvited with the purposeful directness of a gate slammed in a storm. The boat smelled of diesel and canvas, and the rhythmic slap of the bow on waves counted seconds without a watch. Pelicans, if they were there, rode the air and watched with an old, steady gaze. Sandbars shifted as if the shore were breathing. At the ramp, time kinked, the slow approach, the sudden hurry, the stagger into a new texture underfoot where pellets were either irrelevant or definitive. That is the paradox of the shotgun, measured nothing and measured everything, depending on the distance at which a problem declared itself. You cannot ask it to be more than it is. You can be grateful that it refuses to be less. Back at training strips cut into scrub, instructors hung the same battered paper target and chalked new circles, then called out names under a heat that pressed like a hand on their backs. Students advanced and fired, feeling the push into shoulders that had been rubbed sore by packs, not caring that chalk dust drifted into their mouths and tasted like rain that had dried too quickly. Counting holes felt like counting heartbeat rhythms after running. Method calmed nerves. Questions rose. How far could confidence be a circle and not a guess? And then settled when boards told truths without comment. The instructor's pencil taps against wood sounded like a metronome inside the day's larger noise. As shadows lengthened, the smell of crushed grass and burnt powder mingled into a scent that many later said they remembered better than any particular phrase. Measurement had a smell, and it steadied them. In ranks where the Arisaka's long barrel set the tone, the sudden revelation of a tool that made nearby space unfriendly felt like discovering an unexpected eddy in a river thought well mapped. It was not just pain or damage, it was a rearrangement of courage's placement, as if the places deemed safe and unsafe had swapped quietly overnight. Men accustomed to stalking and pressing in, guided by moonlight and the smell of canvas, found at the wire a counter-ritual that belonged to no elegance they had practiced. The wooden stocks they had oiled with perfumed cloth, the blades they had honed to a hush, met not finesse but the coarse pitch of scattered lead. No doctrine ends in a single instant, but a habit can trip and look up startled. In those narrow bands of space where a shotgun's cloud owned the night, the shock belonged to plans more than bodies. After armies packed up their tents, training posts set aside racks of pumps for riot control and guard duty, reassigning them from urgent to mundane with a flip of a clipboard page that crackled under fluorescent hum. Muscles accustomed to tension relaxed into routines, polish, count, stow. The weapon still smelled of oil, but it was oil touched only by piece. The chalkboards went to the dump or to a cupboard that stuck in the wet season, and their circles faded to ghosts. Suppression does not always come in uniforms. Sometimes it arrives in the form of boredom and dust. In that long pause, the story of shock at near range became a footnote that quietly waited under a portion of the index that no one consulted much, except on nights when an old hand told a young one about a board with chalk rings and holes that did not lie. The horizon is a slow bruise. Crickets bow a constant note. The lantern's skin warms to a low glow. Mechanics mattered, as they always do to people who use tools daily. Twin action bars spread force in smooth symmetry, and the pump's glide felt like a draw on perfect runners. The bolt face flashed briefly in lamplight when stripped. The extractor's claw held brass in a way your fingertips could comprehend instantly. To stroke the pump under stress, many practiced until the motion was muscle rather than thought, their palms reading the four-ends grooves like braille. The sound of cycling could be theatrical in movies. In reality, the quiet forms were prized, a firm movement that closed decisively without announcing itself beyond the unavoidable clack. That sound nonetheless had texture-oiled, dense, a wooden train leaving a tiny station in a forest. Mechanics become music when your ear is tuned. Music becomes reassurance when the day chafes. Bottom ejecting designs solved a minor jungle grammar problem. Hot shells thrown sideways bounce unpredictably in tight spaces, but shells sliding out below fall into your own small weather, usually onto your boot where they brand tiny moons through thin canvas. Mud lifts that brand later, leaving circles that fan out like peeled paint. Ergonomics in such places presents itself not in brochures but in how fewer things interfere. A crossbolt safety under the finger pad grows as inevitable as a light switch in a familiar room. These tiny features taste of factory floors and drafting tables, yet their flavor deepens in wet air where even one fewer snag means one fewer stumble. In the yard of use, small kindnesses multiply. The tools become less the star than the craftsman. That is as it should be when the stakes hum. The sand remembers, instruments hum, the hollow waits. The sand remembers, instruments hum, the hollow waits. Some carried an auto-loading design with a long recoil thump that felt like a heartbeat under leather. The barrel telescoping backward in a way that startled the uninitiated, like a fish tugging unexpectedly at a line. Under palm shade, inertia did its quiet work as steel, oil, and springs translated explosion into repetition. The limit was always the hand and eye. The tool can be ready faster than a human can think. Shells arced from the side, clinking onto plank floors that smelled of diesel and sea. Automatic sometimes meant reliable and sometimes meant complicated. Those who chose it did so for reasons as tactile as they were theoretical. In a climate where sweat perfumed everything, where even ink bled, reliability that could be felt rather than inferred mattered. Men made choices and then lived with the weight of those choices in their hands. Across countless nights, the quiet reckoning of a maintenance bench became a kind of altar. A rag folded to the same thickness each time, a bottle of oil with a dent in its side, a tin of grease that smelled sharp and sweet in the nostrils. These created a rhythm that did not forget the jungle even under peacetime roofs. Shells were counted in stacks of 5 that clicked softly as they touched. Brass was rubbed until it looked like small suns. No prayers were said, yet reverence clung. Patterns emerged in the work: wipe, inspect, bolt back, wipe again, record the count in a blocky script, close the ledger. The day held its breath differently at that bench than in the field, but it still held it, as if memory were a taste you could neither swallow nor spit out. The geometry lived in hands even when the chalkboards were gone. Stories of night alarms stopped suddenly by a single blistering report multiplied across bunkhouse talk, not as gory trophies, but as breaths held and released. What held men in safety was not only the weapon, but the knowledge that the first meter of danger could be owned by something capable of writing on air at once. This did not make anyone brave who was not already steady, yet it tipped the scale practically. A rifle demands threading a needle. A shotgun demands sweeping a small broom. The difference mattered in counting who woke up the next morning. Here and there one might ask, what does shock look like when it is more idea than injury? Perhaps it is a person who thought the world had one dependable shape, learning quickly that maps change at the doorstep. He wrote home about weather because it was easier to describe than routines. He said the rain perfumed his shirt and drew lizards out to sun between storms. He mentioned coconuts dropping with a thunk like someone knocking with their knuckles on the roof of the day. Between those sentences there were gaps that smelled faintly of oil. He folded his letter crisply and let the ink dry in curls where the pen had paused. He did not write about the board with holes, nor about the night the pump answered a problem in a syllable no one had practiced saying. In its absence, the letter carried more than it admitted, which is not a failing but a kind of craft. In choosing what to say and what to leave in the margins, he was measuring too. The bay whispers. Leaves keep secrets. The waves write and erase the same line. One of the quietest truths is how the human hand expects certain distances to be meaningful and then finds them rearranged by technology. The range that felt brave for a charge became, in the presence of buttshot, a zone of instant confusion. The range that felt safe for creeping became a place where geometry suddenly turned adversary. The adjustment feels plangent in recollection. The frog chorus is no different. The sand still clings to socks, but a tool redrew a circle, and everything inside it learned to bow differently. Valor did not vanish. It merely had to decide whether to flow around a corridor no longer yours. The experience invites reflection more than boasting, as any honest veteran will admit when the light softens and a kettle warms on the stove. Map lovers know, even small notations can change entire routes. Field improvisations of equipment said as much about climate and anxiety as any manual. Stocks shortened a fraction for gear-heavy torsos, slings woven from local cordage that left faint plant smells. On palms, rubber left installed where doctrine might prefer it removed, for the sake of a tighter feel in rain-slick nights. Shells rode in cut-down bandoliers that creaked like new shoes. Rows of brass peeked over pack pockets like spice jars arranged in a careful pantry. Tape left gummy ghosts on fore ends where lantern light glossed over them. In the same way a garden fence tells you more about a gardener than about the seeds, these choices told of the people who handled shock head-on in the places where shock lived. They believed not in mystique, but in preparedness that other people would find unremarkable at a glance. The rumor about illegality wove back in, a wandering vine that grew where there was any trellis of etiquette to cling to, and it was pruned politely in footnotes that confirmed what careful officers already knew. Men remembered hearing their elders mention a European protest, and they repeated it in whispers that sounded almost relieved when debunked. The rumor tasted old, like a dried plum found at the bottom of a field bag, still edible, no longer sweet. In the meantime, the work of near defense continued, unaffected. Such is the nature of polite myths. They continue to be told long after the labor they deny has made its point. That labor smelled of sweat, gun oil, and crushed grass, and it left under fingernails a faint ring of black that took a minute's scrubbing to erase. After the big machines and banners left, some governments sold off or scrapped remaining trench guns, pressing one last rectangle of clerical authority onto tools that had long ago served their most urgent hours. The scrap hands wore gloves and folded paper that still bore stamps impressed by earlier palms, then watched as the metal changed tone and became raw material again. Collectors decades later followed those light paper trails like river maps, finding odd survivors forgotten in armory corners that smelled of solvents, chalk, and time. Suppression takes many forms: disposal, mislabeling, quiet shelving. Rediscovery, too, has its own costumes: estate sales where lemon oil perfumes the room, auctions that hum, and quiet donations made by people who want things remembered softly. The tools themselves say little. Their dents and rubs are the only sentences they kept for themselves. A curator in a small museum cleaned a heat shield with a cotton swab dipped in solution that smelled faintly of apples, lifting tarnish like fog peeling from a hillside in morning sun. Children pressed noses to glass and left faint fogged circles as she explained that the ribbed shroud was not just decoration, but a way to keep a hand from burning after repeated shots. Light from windows crossed the floor in slow, pale bands, dust motes wheeled. The gun's wood glowed with a satin warmth under that light, not menacing, not innocent, simply itself. She did not tell war stories. She pointed to holes in a pattern card and let those speak. The room, steeped in soft footsteps and whispers, held 2 times at once, the frantic and the careful. The feel of the moment invited calm rather than dread. In a gravel pit used for ballistics testing, modern researchers propped gelatin blocks marked with grid lines and filmed pellet penetration under high-speed cameras that chirped softly when rolling. The smell of clean, cold earth rose as shovels scraped to level a platform. At 20 paces, the buckshot cloud wrote a tidy lyric. At 40, it turned into prose. Beyond, it devolved into rumor and then afterthought. The video replayed under a tent that flapped idly in breeze, and the screen showed tiny temporary cavitations that looked for an instant like underwater blossoms. The researchers spoke low, not out of reverence, but because many of them had learned that the numbers had their own voice if you let them. They wrote distances and depths on a whiteboard with a squeak that set teeth slightly on edge. It was not dramatic, it was the drama of accuracy. Dawn light slanted through a coastal copse where an archaeologist wore gloves and sifted soil through a wire screen that sang a thin metallic hiss. He found a small cluster of tiny lead pellets welded together by time, shaped into a dull berry that rolled slowly in his palm. Nearby, in a fallen coconut trunk, a pattern of tiny craters told a story in a language the hand could read. Pine-scented sunscreen joined the breath of the grove, which still carried the sweet damp of the previous night. The cluster, X-rayed later, revealed a whirl like a little galaxy, a record of flight slowed to a freeze. He logged its depth below surface, taste of grit on his lip, shade cool on his neck. If history is sometimes a matter of taste, a bias, a flavor, then this piece tasted of lead, wood, and patience. Divers on a follow-up survey found a whole pump gun cradled by coral heads, as if the reef had decided to keep it in a careful nook. It wore pink and ivory incrustations like sea jewelry, and small fish flitted through the receiver as if it were a cave. Lifting it, they heard brittle sounds like old bread breaking, the ocean's pressure having fused and set what once had flexed. Up top, they bathed it in fresh water, knowing that the metal would crumble further even under loving attention. The deck smelled of brine and neoprene. The sun cooked out the chill in their shoulders. In the end, it became a teaching object, a testimony to both salt and steel. Not everything is saved. Not everything that is saved can be made whole. Understanding accepts partial gifts. In a quiet home, a veteran of that era held a sporting shotgun at a club demonstration and let his hands remember things his mouth did not elaborate on. Steam from a teacup climbed gently and dissolved. He watched it and said nothing for a moment. He ran a cloth over the barrel, then over the stock, and he nodded when someone explained patterning with a casual confidence that came from afternoons under sun. He mentioned wind, humidity, and the way patterns open like flowers slightly sooner in wet air. He did not mention fear, nor shock, nor even the ocean, yet his knuckles tightened very slightly around walnut when someone worked the pump, and it made its honest sound. Old bodies carry their own archives, and sometimes the only language they need is a fingertip over polished steel. Marks on metal told their own quiet tales under magnification. Inspector stamps small as beetles, proof marks like cups pressed into bread dough, serial numbers rubbed softly by generations of cloth. Heat shrouds still bore the regularity of their vent holes, and in the gaps, salt crystals winked like tiny stars. The butt plates checkering, when cleaned of grime, pricked a thumb like a pinecone's scales. The bayonet lug's edges caught glints of light that travelled along them and then fell away onto shadow. In this close world, everything had texture first and meaning later, which is the proper order for learning when sleep is near. You can know the history and still be moved by the feel. You can know the feel and then seek history like a map after a walk. Critiques persisted, honest and healthy. The weapon that ruled at near range fell quiet farther out. It lost to rifles on open approaches. It ran out of shells more quickly, and reloading under fire felt like carrying water in cupped hands. These are not contradictions, they are the bones of competence. Many commanders favored mixed patrols, arraying skills the way a gardener arrays plants, some for shade, some for fruit, some for scent. The shotgun's fruit lay in tight places and in sudden visits. Asked to bless a field at distance, it demurred. Its power created not supremacy but a pocket of control, a small sanctuary around a person that pushed longer teeth back by a single step. That was enough on nights when the wire edged into your sleep like a hard thought. A forward observer later once described the odd peace that followed, a near alarm resolved by a short reply, mussed hair, a few spent shells warm like coins found in laundry, the night resuming its insect choir almost as if clearing its throat. Schedules are fragile in war. The importance of a tool that keeps the clock face intact for the next hour cannot be overstated, yet it cannot be melodramatized either. Not every breach grows into a storm. Sometimes it is a lost leaf pushed away from a drain. The observer sipped bitter coffee that perfumed the narrow command post, light from a red lens torch glossing his cup's rim. He nudged a pellet with his boot to the corner, a small thing, and turned a page. Control is not glamour, it is a page turn. The lagoon glass, the vine's dream. The pattern board sleeps in a storeroom and counts nothing, yet it is counted on. That famous rack of the pump, celebrated in movies, sits somewhere between myth and comfort in reality. Men learn to cycle quietly, because announcing one's readiness has mixed value when the dark is listening. Yet even when muted, the mechanism speaks to the hand, assuring like the click of a latch in a room you know. Silence can be braver than declaration. For those who used it, the cadence of shuck and seat wove into muscle, as reliably as the sound of a zipper before a storm tightens a tent against gusts. Ferocity is not a tone, it is a capacity that, when leashed by discipline, appears as calm. The pump's true poetry, then, is its offer, be steady and I will be with you in the space that matters. Training on the other side of the ocean evolved with other emphases, yet the scarcity of compact automatic arms meant that many units faced close work with longer tools that had been honed for a different theater. The mismatch tasted like biting into an unripe fruit, sharp, astringent, memorable, and instructive. Some adapted through cunning, some suffered through assumption, some learned new steps mid-dance. Equipment is a teacher whose aroma lingers long after the lesson, and for those who survived, the faint scent of oil and humidity easily evokes spaces where plans were redrawn on the fly. Much later, historians listening gently to veterans can hear the places where confidence thinned in memory, not as confession but as topography. The thickness of air is part of that map. Pillboxes and tunnels demanded bespoke grammars of entry, and the shotgun spoke one of those dialects with clarity that did not swagger. Dust prickled throats, sour sweat dripped into eyebrows, boots grated on sand that squeaked faintly in confined spaces. The first wariness belongs to the entrance where sunlight stops, the second belongs to corners, the third belongs to dead ends that are not. The tool that can end a question immediately without ricochet writing bills for the future has a special worth in such catechisms. Grenades wrote louder answers, and they had their place, but sometimes a broom is better than a hammer, particularly when walls that do not belong to you still need to be there tomorrow. These are nuances recorded more in practice than in prose. Legal debates drifted on, anchored to a European moment, but visited and revisited across oceans, finally landing where they should, on the understanding that no clear clause had ever banished the weapon from the field. The old protest had been answered firmly and then filed not as doctrine but as correspondence. The echo lingered longer than the incident, because echoes love wood-panelled rooms. In the field, standard loads kept moving from crate to palm, tally to ledger, ledger to memory. Laws smell of dry paper and beeswax polish, use smells of oil and rain. In reconciling those scents, many found the air cleared and stood easier under its open sky. A clean conscience is not a myth, it is a tool too. The post-war culture borrowed and reimagined, placing the pump in every closet of the popular imagination until it lived as metaphor as much as metal. That made it harder, not easier, to hold the truth of those first colliding motifs, measurement against myth. The screen's fog plastered across felt old, like weather. The sound design exaggerated where the hand would rather understate. Collectors quietly put boards back in play, re-chalking circles and tapping thumbtacks into plywood with soft candle wax-smelling hammers. Children who came along to the range learned the smell of burnt powder as neutrally as they learned the smell of a library. The story swelled here, shrank there, yet the measured heart kept beating in its center whenever anyone bothered to bring paper, chalk, and the willingness to test. Numbers settle. The surf hushes. The caliper's jaw closes gently on everything that can be held. On more than one ridge, soldiers on both sides learned that a green corridor that smelled of crushed fern dictated weapons more than orders, and that the cellar tool that cleaned a threshold could be the difference between collapse and a night's rest. Wind ran fingers down grasses like a harp strings. The moon diluted color to damp silver. In that light, the odd heft of a short barrel pump made sense again, and the myth of birds fell away like a jacket shrugged off in warmth. People who walked those nights associate certain sounds with sleep now: zippers, the rustle of palm, the way small lizards tap their tails on walls like soft drums, and, sometimes, the distant, remembered mechanical sigh of a thing made to say yes in one syllable to a question asked at too close range. The motif returns to where it began, a board marked in chalk, pellets counted, a circle filled like a blossom opening under a slow hand. The armorer's pencil scratches lightly, the calluses on his fingers feel the grit in the paper, and the smell of old paste and mildew rises like a ghost. A rumor approaches. The old tale that these were only for ducks and pheasants, and it dissolves when a board says no. Across a century and more, a caliper's click corrected bluster and a chalk ring captured breath, suggesting that even in places described with roaring terms, humbler instruments have the last word. Soft light falls across wood grain. A moth beats itself briefly against a shade. Somewhere outside, rain begins. The myth does not die because it is dramatic to do so, but because being practical is a more comfortable way to sleep. In a mountain training ground touched by cool fogs that tasted faintly of stone and wet grass, a pattern test repeated quietly under the gaze of people who had never been to a palm shore. They watched holes appear in paper and nodded. They walked to 40 paces and frowned. They walked back to 30 and smiled again. The world is full of distances asking to be named properly. The rifle and the shotgun shook hands there under a light that softened edges and made jackets smell like wool and clean air. They were not enemies, merely different lines crossed by different kinds of willed steps. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A tool does not need legend to be valuable. It needs use that knows where it begins and ends. Later, an archivist sat with a dehumidifier humming, pinning a brittle board flat and weighing its corners with muslin bags filled with glass beads. She tasted dust and distant salt in the air when the machine paused. Her eyes, tired but calm, traced the arcs and learned them as if they were a prayer in a language that does not admit translation. The edges cracked under the lightest touch. She steadied a seam with the gentlest brush of adhesive, not altering meaning, only preserving texture. On her screen, a note sat open. 12-gauge pattern board, field test, recovered from Island Depot, catalogued. She looked at the word recovered and felt its weight. The romance of war belongs to other rooms. Here, in this one, things become legible. One chalk ring at a time, one tiny palette round polished like a mirror under a fingertip. In that same city, a collector laid a trench gun carefully into a case lined with green felt that gave off a faint scent like apples and old cloth. He had learned to handle it as if it were a sleeping cat, neither rigid nor sloppy, always attentive to the way metal meets fabric. The heat shield's perforations looked like a music score. The bayonet lug waited without impatience. He closed the lid and felt the latch kiss its socket. Outside his window, traffic washed by like rain. Inside, he felt the memory of a jungle he had not walked, because objects sometimes carry climates with them in their geometry. The value here was not money, it was clarity. The 1,000 small truths the object insists upon in the face of 1,000 louder but thinner tales. At a beach where veterans return to stand barefoot and let warm water lick their ankles, one of them holds a caliper in his pocket like a talisman, and when he pulls it out, he clicks it at 18.5mm and smiles privately. He has no need to explain. The wind tastes of salt and sunscreen. Children laugh and throw shell fragments that glitter like fish scales. He is not reliving shock, he is honoring measurement. The day feels round, and a circle drawn on a board long ago remembers him better than any parade could. He leaves no wreath, only footprints the tide erases easily. The caliper goes back into cloth, and the metal smells faintly of his skin, which smells faintly of the ocean. In between inventories, in between letters, in between the myth and the board, one older man, Japanese by birth and quiet by habit, sits with a grandson at a kitchen table now, instructing him on how to hold a chisel for schoolwork, not to pry but to persuade wood. Steam from miso rises, comforting. He does not talk of the island where night once opened like a trapdoor. He mentions instead that geometry is the art of kindness. To wood, to iron, and to other people, in knowing how much pressure is enough and how much is too much. He breathes in through his nose, out through his mouth, and the memory of shock has long ago been moved from front shelf to back cupboard. The cupboard still opens, it simply does not intrude during dinner. Somewhere else, a restorer aligns a bayonet lug on a barrel with a slip of paper marked with pencil lines, listening for the microscopic scrape that tells him when metal meets metal as they should. He has no illusions about grandeur. His shop smells of sawdust and oil, and light through the window turns dust into something almost edible, golden and soft. He holds the work with love but no romance, that is the best way. The pattern board on his wall, a reproduction for demonstration, bears neat circles and neat holes. Visitors ask about birds. He smiles, nodding, and then tells them what the board measures and does not measure, how it defines not a life but a task, and how that task saved many. The visitors nod, the shop breathes. And so we arrive gently at a place where myth and measure can sit together without quarrel, illuminated by the patient lamplight of record keepers and the soft daylight of remembered work. The 12-gauge trench gun occupies its narrow corridor of force, neither larger nor smaller than it is, yet entirely decisive where it belongs. Japanese troops shocked by it were not cowards or fools. They were people meeting a geometry that their maps had not marked, just as Americans sometimes met geometries they did not enjoy. In the end, what remains is the way a chalk circle on a board can change a night, and the way a caliper's jaw can close on a number that holds its shape against the tide. The ocean keeps breathing, the paper keeps its holes. The question